Welcome to Warborn. This is where dark history begins. Subscribe, and let's begin. The trap that burned the Vikings alive. The sea was not supposed to become their grave. Not for men like these. Not for warriors who had crossed the northern oceans as if the water itself belonged to them. Not for men who had watched villages burn, kings tremble, and priests fall to their knees before a single striped sail appeared on the horizon. The Vikings had spent decades teaching Europe one lesson. When the longships arrived, death arrived with them. But in the year 859 AD, Björn Ironside led thousands of warriors south into a world they did not understand. And there, beneath the sun of Iberia, the old rules stopped working. The north had given them courage. The sea had given them speed. Their gods had given them certainty. But the south had something else: memory, engineering, patience, and fire. Björn Ironside did not sail south as a desperate man. He sailed as a man trying to escape a shadow, the shadow of Ragnar Lothbrok. His father's name was already carved into the imagination of the Viking world. Ragnar was not remembered like an ordinary warrior. He was remembered like a storm. A man whose legend was bigger than his body. A man whose death only made his name louder. And for Björn, that was the problem. Every raid he completed, every coast he struck, every enemy he broke, still felt like a small chapter inside a book that belonged to someone else. In the world of the Vikings, bloodlines mattered, but glory mattered more. A son could inherit a famous name, but he still had to prove that he deserved to carry it. Björn wanted more than wealth, more than silver, more than slaves. He wanted the kind of fame that made men lower their voices when they spoke his name. He wanted to do something so enormous that even Ragnar's ghost would be forced to step aside. So he gathered a fleet, 62 longships, thousands of hardened fighters, men who had lived so long with violence that peace would have felt like a foreign language. They came from cold islands, river mouths, coastal settlements, and warrior households, where boys grew up learning that fear was something to give to other people. These were not random raiders, they were veterans. Men who had already seen the inside of burning churches. Men who knew how to move before dawn, how to land quietly, how to kill quickly, how to disappear before the local ruler even understood that his coastline had been opened like a wound. Beside Björn stood Hastein. And Hastein was different. Björn had the hunger of a man chasing legend. Hastein had the mind of a man who knew how to turn other people's beliefs against them. He understood panic. He understood pride. He understood that sometimes a locked gate could be opened faster with a story than with an axe. Together, they did not plan a raid. They planned an expedition into myth. The destination was the south, the warm world, the rich world, the unknown world beyond the usual reach of Viking ships. To the men of the north, the south was not a place. It was a rumor. A land of gold, churches, merchants, soft rulers, and cities so wealthy that a single successful attack could make a warlord immortal. They imagined harbors full of treasure, monasteries without defenders, coastlines that had never heard the scream of a Viking war horn. In their minds, every southern city was already half conquered. All they had to do was arrive. That was their first mistake. The second mistake was believing that fear worked everywhere. In the north, Viking warfare had become a system. The longships were fast, their hulls were shallow. They could move through rivers and strike places that believed themselves safe. They could appear without warning and vanish before a response could form. The weapon was not only the axe, it was timing, shock, confusion. A town that had 3 days to prepare could resist. A town that had 3 minutes could only scream. For decades, that method had made the Vikings look almost supernatural. But every method has a weakness, and the Viking weakness was simple. They needed the enemy to be surprised. Without surprise, they were still dangerous, but they were no longer magic. 15 years before Björn's expedition, another Norse fleet had sailed into the lands of al-Andalus. In 844 AD, Viking raiders moved up the Guadalquivir River and struck Seville. The attack was devastating. The city bled. The shock reached deep into the political heart of the Emirate of Córdoba. But Abd ar-Rahman II, the ruler of al-Andalus, did not respond like a man who had only been wounded. He responded like a man who had been given information. He studied the Vikings. He looked at what made them dangerous: their speed, their surprise, their ships, their willingness to strike undefended places and avoid strong resistance. He understood that the Vikings did not win because they were invincible. They won because their enemies were always late. So he began building a world where no one would be late again. Watchtowers were strengthened along the coast. Signal systems were organized. Fire could carry a warning from tower to tower faster than a ship could move across the horizon. A landing spotted in one place could wake an entire region. A threat seen by one guard could become known to commanders miles away before the first raider reached the sand. And then came the Navy. Not improvised boats, not panicked merchant vessels pressed into service. A permanent force, warships, crews, commanders. Men trained not to react emotionally to Viking terror, but to answer it with formation, distance, and discipline. The Vikings believed they were sailing toward an easy world, but the world they were approaching had been built out of the memory of their last attack. That is what they did not understand. The South had not forgotten. The South had been preparing. For 15 years, when Björn's fleet appeared near the western coast of Iberia, the men on the longships expected the familiar pattern. First, the sighting, then panic, then screaming, then a rushed defense, then collapse. But this time the pattern broke immediately. Along the coast, signal fires rose into the air. 1 flame became 2, became 10. 10 became a chain. The warning moved faster than the longships. The coastline did not sleep, it woke up. Before the Vikings could fully prepare their landing, the defense system had already begun to close around them. And then the sails appeared. Not weak vessels, not frightened merchants. Warships. Cordoban warships. Built heavier than the Viking longships. Manned by trained crews. Commanded by men who had no intention of fighting the way the Vikings wanted them to fight. That was the first true shock. The Vikings wanted closeness. They wanted the crash of wood against wood. They wanted to leap over rails, swing axes, split shields, and turn the battle into the kind of chaos they understood. But the Andalusian commanders did not give them that. They stayed away, out of axe range, out of boarding range, out of the Viking world. Then they attacked from distance. The weapons that came next must have seemed impossible to many of the men watching from the northern ships. Clay containers, fire projectiles, liquid flame, naphtha, a burning substance that clung to what it touched. It could spread across wood. It could crawl along surfaces. It could burn on water. To men who trusted oak, rope, shields, and courage, this was not just a weapon. It was a nightmare that ignored their entire way of fighting. The first fire struck the longships, then the second, then the third. The decks became chaos. Ropes caught, sails caught. Pitch and tar fed the flames. The ships that had carried Viking terror across Europe became their own funeral pyres. A longship was a masterpiece of speed, but it was also a body made of wood. And the South had found the perfect way to kill it. The men tried to fight the fire as if fire could be intimidated. They hacked at burning rigging, they threw water, they raised shields. But shields made of wood only became more fuel. Chainmail, which had saved men from blades, became a prison for heat. The warriors who had spent their lives believing pain was something to endure discovered a kind of pain that did not care about bravery. Some men leapt overboard, but the surface of the water itself burned in places. Others sank beneath it, dragged downward by armor, weapons, and panic. The sea offered no mercy. Above them was flame, below them was weight. For the first time, the Vikings were caught between two deaths and could not fight either one. The Cordoban ships continued their work. They did not rush. They did not rage. They did not need to prove courage. They simply kept distance and launched again, and again, and again. That may have been the most terrifying part for Björn. The enemy was not trying to impress anyone. The enemy was not screaming insults. The enemy was not chasing glory. The enemy was performing a task. The Vikings had brought a religion of violence. Córdoba answered with procedure. And procedure was winning. Björn Ironside stood there watching his fleet burn and saw something more than ships die. He saw the Viking myth begin to crack. The idea that terror could solve every problem. The idea that courage could overcome every weapon. The idea that if a man was willing to die, the world had to respect him. The fire respected nothing. The rational choice was obvious. Retreat. Save what remained. Turn north. Leave the southern coast before the entire expedition collapsed. But Björn had not sailed south to make rational choices. He had sailed south to become larger than his father, and a man obsessed with legacy often mistakes retreat for death. So he did not go home. He pushed deeper. The battered fleet moved toward the Guadalquivir, toward the route that had once led Vikings to Seville. To Björn and Hastein, Seville represented recovery. If they could reach the city, if they could sack it again, if they could drag enough gold from it, then Lisbon would become only a wound, a setback, a heroic struggle before the real victory. That is how pride protects itself. It turns warning signs into tests. It calls disaster a beginning. But the Seville they imagined no longer existed. The river mouth was no longer open. The defenses were no longer weak. 15 years had changed everything. And when the Vikings tried to force their way in, they found themselves entering another prepared space. The river narrowed around them. The banks limited movement. Their ships could no longer use open water to maneuver freely. The enemy understood the terrain better. The Andalusian forces struck again. Arrows fell, stones smashed into wood. More fire came down onto ships already scarred from the first engagement. The longships that had once moved like wolves now struggled like animals trapped in a pit. Every push forward became more expensive. Every decision made, retreat more difficult. And still Björn refused to accept what was happening. The expedition was not simply unlucky, it was being dismantled, piece by piece, by people who had studied exactly how Viking warfare worked. That is the difference between bravery and intelligence. Bravery can carry a man into danger. Intelligence tells him what kind of danger he is actually facing. The Vikings had plenty of bravery, but they had almost no understanding of the system closing around them. After the disaster near Seville, The surviving fleet ran again, not north, south, toward the Strait of Gibraltar, toward the narrow gate between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. For the Vikings, that passage looked like escape. Behind them was a coastline that had learned how to burn them. Ahead of them was the Mediterranean, a new sea, new targets, new chances, a place where, they believed, the defenses of Córdoba would not follow. As the surviving longships moved through the strait, something strange happened. The pressure faded. The Andalusian ships that had hunted and harassed them seemed to pull back. The Vikings saw open water ahead, the warm blue interior of the Mediterranean. The wounded men on the decks must have felt something close to relief. They had survived. They had forced their way through. They had escaped the trap. Or so they thought. But sometimes a predator opens its jaws, not because it has failed to bite, but because it wants the prey deeper inside. The Córdoban Navy did not need to destroy every Viking ship at the entrance. It only needed to understand geography. There was one way in, there was one way out. The Vikings had just entered a sea that could become a cage. At first, the Mediterranean seemed to prove Björn right. The fleet raided along the coasts and islands, North Africa, the Balearic Islands, small settlements, religious communities, harbors that weren't prepared for northern violence. There were no great defensive chains waiting everywhere, no instant wall of warships at every shore, no liquid fire falling from the sky at every landing. The old method began working again. Strike, terrify, loot, leave. And with each successful attack, the Vikings began to rebuild the illusion that had almost died in Iberia. They told themselves the earlier disasters had been temporary. They told themselves Córdoba had been one hard enemy, not a warning. They told themselves the south was still theirs to take. But every victory carried a hidden cost: weight. The longships began filling with plunder: silver, gold, bronze, church objects, fine fabrics, weapons, tools. Everything that could be taken was taken. And then there were captives. Men and women seized from the places the Vikings struck, chained aboard ships that were never designed to carry so much human weight for so long. A Viking longship was not built like a cargo ship. It was not meant to sit heavy in the water. It was meant to remain light, fast, responsive, able to skim across waves, slide into shallows, and vanish before heavier enemies could trap it. But with every raid, the waterline rose higher. The hulls sank lower. The oars grew harder to move. The ships became slower, less agile, more vulnerable. And still, no one wanted to throw anything away. Because the treasure was not only wealth, it was evidence. Evidence that the expedition had meaning. Evidence that the dead had not died for nothing. Evidence that Björn's dream had not become madness. This is how greed becomes a prison. At first you carry the treasure. Then the treasure carries you. And then it drags you down. But Björn and Hastein still needed something greater than island raids. They had not crossed the edge of their known world just to burn small harbors. They needed a target worthy of song, a target that could erase every loss, a target so important that even defeat along the way would be remembered as courage. They needed Rome, the eternal city, the heart of Western Christendom, the throne of the Pope, a symbol so powerful that the mere rumor of its fall would shake the world. If they could sack Rome, everything else would disappear. The burned ships, the lost men, the failed attack near Seville, the humiliation. All of it would be swallowed by one sentence: Björn Ironside took Rome. So the fleet, turned along the Italian coast, searching, watching, trying to identify the city they had come to break. But here, another weakness revealed itself. The Vikings were brilliant sailors in their own world. They could read the northern seas. They could cross terrifying distances. They could navigate by stars, coastlines, wind, and instinct. But the Mediterranean was not their map. Its cities, distances, political centers, and sacred geography were unfamiliar. They were lethal men moving through a world they could not properly read, and eventually they saw it. A wealthy city, strong walls, white stone, churches, trade, movement, power. To exhausted men desperate for a final victory, it looked like enough. They declared it Rome. It was not Rome. It was Luna, a rich coastal city, yes. Important, yes. But not Rome. Not the eternal city, not the prize that would make them immortal. They had mistaken a provincial city for the symbolic heart of the Christian world. It was a mistake so enormous that it almost feels impossible. But it happened because the expedition had always been built on hunger, not knowledge. They knew how to kill, they knew how to raid, they knew how to terrify, but they did not know where they were. And that ignorance was now steering the fleet. Still, Luna would not fall easily to a direct assault. The walls were too strong. The Viking force was too damaged. A siege would take time. A frontal attack would cost men they could no longer afford to lose. So Hastein turned to the weapon he understood best: deception. He ordered a coffin built, large, heavy, ornate enough to matter. Then he climbed inside it. The story sent to Luna was perfect. The great Viking chieftain had died. Not in battle, not by the sword, but from sickness. And before his death, surrounded by fear of the afterlife, he had abandoned the old gods. He had accepted Christianity. His final wish was simple: to be buried inside the city in sacred ground with Christian rites. It was a brilliant lie because it was designed for the people who heard it. The Bishop of Luna did not only hear a burial request, he heard a miracle, a pagan warlord converted at death, a savage brought into the faith, a story that could lift a provincial bishop into the attention of powerful churchmen. Ambition softened his caution. Religious triumph drowned out military instinct. The gates opened, the coffin entered. Around it walked Vikings, pretending to grieve. Men who had burned churches now bowed their heads before one. Men who had killed priests now performed sorrow for them. They tore their clothing. They lowered their voices. They carried the coffin through the streets, as if carrying the body of a leader they loved. Inside the church, incense filled the air. Clergy gathered. Nobles watched. Prayers were spoken. The city believed it was witnessing the victory of faith over barbarism. Then the coffin opened. Hastein rose from the dead, not as a convert, as a weapon. The mourners became attackers. Blades appeared. The church doors were seized. The heart of the city was trapped before the defenders understood what had happened. The bishop, who had opened the gate for a miracle, found himself inside a deception built with perfect cruelty. The Vikings cut through the sacred space. Panic spread outward. The city's defenses collapsed from within. Hastein's trick had worked. It was ruthless. It was brilliant. It was one of the most infamous deceptions of the Viking Age. And it was wasted on the wrong city. Because after the killing, after the looting, after the city had been broken, the truth reached the conquerors. This was not Rome. This was Luna. Rome was far away. For a moment, the victory became heavier than defeat. Imagine the silence. The men who had survived fire off Iberia, the men who had pushed into the Mediterranean, the men who had followed Björn and Hastein through hunger, storm, and blood. All of them forced to understand that the greatest trick of the expedition had been spent on a mistake. They had not shaken Christendom. They had not taken the eternal city. They had not surpassed Ragnar. They had conquered the wrong place. That kind of humiliation cannot be easily carried by violent men. So Hastein answered humiliation with destruction. Luna was punished not because it needed to be punished, not because it was strategically necessary, but because it had become proof the Vikings were lost, proof that they were ignorant, proof that their great southern expedition was rotting from the inside. So they destroyed what they could. They took what remained. They left smoke behind them. And then they returned to their ships, carrying something worse than defeat. They carried shame. By now, the fleet was barely the fleet that had left the north. The ships were damaged, the crews were reduced, the holds were overloaded, the men were tired in a way that sleep could not fix. They had spent too long in hostile waters, too long under sun they were not used to, too long fighting enemies who did not behave like the enemies of the north. And then the Mediterranean itself turned against them. As the fleet moved west, the sky changed. The air tightened. The pressure dropped. The sea darkened. Then the wind came. The Mistral, a violent wind that can tear down toward the Mediterranean and transform the water into a field of short, steep, punishing waves. The Vikings were master sailors, no one could deny that. But even mastery depends on conditions. The Northern Ocean had its own violence, deep swells, long distances, cold, open water. The Mediterranean storm was different. The waves came fast, close together. A ship struck by one barely had time to recover before the next hit, and the Viking ships were no longer light. They were heavy with loot, heavy with captives, heavy with proof, heavy with the very things the men refused to abandon. Water poured over the sides. The oars became harder to manage. Cargo shifted. Men shouted. Some bailed water with helmets. Some tried to secure ropes. Some stared at the rising water inside the hulls and understood the truth faster than their commanders did. The ships were too heavy. The solution was obvious. Throw the treasure into the sea. Lighten the hulls. Save the fleet. But the men hesitated, because throwing away the treasure meant throwing away the story. It meant admitting the expedition had failed. It meant accepting that every death, every burned ship, every mile south had bought nothing. So they held on too long, and the sea punished them. Ships rolled. Some broke, some vanished. Men who had survived swords and fire were dragged beneath the water by armor, cargo, and exhaustion. Silver that had been taken from the living became weight for the dead. Gold became ballast for drowning men. The storm did not need to hate them. It did not need to judge them. It simply obeyed the laws of wind and water. And those laws were enough. When the fleet emerged from the storm, it was broken. The survivors were not singing, they were not boasting, they were not dreaming of Rome. The great southern campaign had become a struggle to breathe. Björn Ironside now had only one real objective: escape, return through the Strait of Gibraltar, reach the Atlantic, crawl north, go home. But the strait was the one place the enemy knew he had to return. And Córdoba had patience, while the Vikings had raided islands, while they had mistaken Luna for Rome, while they had overloaded their ships, while the storm had scattered and weakened them. The Andalusian navy had waited, not everywhere, not randomly, at the one place that mattered, the exit. When Björn's damaged fleet approached Gibraltar, the sight ahead stopped the survivors cold. The passage was not open. The Andalusian fleet was there, fresh, prepared, blocking the way out. The Vikings had believed the Mediterranean was a reward. In reality, it had become a cage. The door that opened behind them was now locked in front of them. This was the final trap. Not a single ambush, not one lucky battle, a design. Let the raiders enter, let them exhaust themselves. Let them fill their ships with weight. Let them suffer storms and confusion. Then wait where geography forces them to return. The Vikings could not go around. They could not disappear into rivers. They could not rely on surprise. They had to pass through the narrow throat of the strait. And the enemy was waiting with fire. The Viking ships entered slowly, too slowly. Hulls sat low. Their crews were weakened. Their formation was poor. The ships that had once been built for speed now moved like floating coffins. The Andalusian commanders did not close in for boarding. They did not offer the Vikings a heroic last stand. They used the same discipline that had broken them before. Distance, formation, fire. Projectiles crossed the air. Burning liquid burst across decks. Ropes ignited. Sails tore into flame. Men ran through smoke with nowhere to go. The strait filled with fire, wreckage, and panic. The Vikings tried to row, but heavy ships do not escape cleanly. Every chest of plunder slowed them. Every stolen object held them in range. Every chain, every weapon, every piece of wealth became part of the enemy's trap. Björn finally understood the terrible equation. The treasure was killing them. The proof of glory had become the reason they could not move. And so he gave the order that must have tasted like death in his mouth. Throw it overboard, all of it. At first, men hesitated. They stared at silver taken from churches, gold taken from towns, objects that had cost lives to steal. They had crossed seas for these things. They had watched friends die for these things. They had told themselves these things would make the whole expedition worth it. Now they had to feed them to the water. Another volley struck. Another ship burned. And pride finally lost to survival. Treasure went over the rails. Chests vanished beneath the surface. Gold disappeared. Silver sank. Relics fell into the dark. The Vikings threw away the story they had come south to create. But the worst weight was not metal. It was human. The captives chained aboard the ships were part of the burden too. And in the terror of the escape, many were thrown into the sea, some still bound, some unable to swim. The fleet bought movement with human lives. It is one of the darkest parts of the story, because in that moment, the entire expedition revealed what it had always been. Not glory, not destiny, not a heroic southern adventure. A hunger so violent that everyone around it became disposable. Enemy, civilian, captive, even the Vikings themselves. Everything was fuel for Björn's need to return as something more than defeated. A few ships made it through, not many. Enough to carry the story home. Enough to keep the names alive, but not enough to save the dream. Behind them, the strait burned. Ahead of them was the Atlantic, cold, empty, endless. The men who escaped were not conquerors. They were remnants, burned, starving, silent. The longships that survived carried almost no treasure. Their crews had lost the look of men who believed themselves chosen. They had seen the South answer them, not with fear, not with panic, but with memory, fire, and patience. Still, Björn and Hastein could not return to Scandinavia empty-handed. In the Viking world, failure was dangerous. A warlord who left with 62 ships and thousands of fighters could not simply return with a handful of damaged hulls and an explanation. Rivals would count the missing men, families would ask where their sons had gone. Other chiefs would see weakness, and weakness invited knives. They needed anything, a final piece of wealth, a ransom, a story. So the broken survivors turned toward the coast of Navarre. There, in 859 AD, they captured King Garcia Íñiguez of Pamplona. This was not the conquest of Rome. It was not the great victory Björn had imagined. It was a kidnapping. A desperate transaction carried out by men who needed gold badly enough to turn survival into strategy. The demand was enormous. 90,000 gold dinars. The ransom was paid. The king was released. And the Vikings finally had something they could take north. Not glory, not the wealth of Rome, not the conquest of the Mediterranean. Just enough gold to give the Skalds something to work with. Just enough to hide the scale of the catastrophe. When the survivors finally returned home, the story had to be reshaped. That is what societies do with failure when the truth is too ugly. The Skalds sang. They spoke of raids in the south, of kings captured, of gold taken, of Viking terror reaching lands no northern fleet had ever dared to strike before. And some of that was true. But it was not the whole truth. Songs can make a ransom sound like victory. They can turn escape into courage. They can make a disaster sound like an adventure. But songs cannot replace dead men. They cannot rebuild burned ships. They cannot erase the memory of fire crawling across a deck. They cannot remove the sight of warriors throwing treasure into the sea because they were too slow to live with it. Björn had sailed south to become greater than Ragnar, but the south taught him a lesson no saga could fully hide. The Vikings were terrifying, but they were not invincible. Their courage was real, but courage was not enough. Their ships were fast, but speed could be stolen by weight. Their violence was powerful, but violence could be studied. Their reputation could paralyze kingdoms, but it could not paralyze a civilization that had already prepared the answer. That was the real victory of Córdoba, not simply burning ships, not simply killing warriors, but breaking the idea that the Vikings couldn't be broken. After this, the world knew something important. The Norsemen could bleed, they could panic, they could be trapped, they could be outthought, they could sail into a system designed to neutralize every strength they possessed. And when they did, the old magic disappeared. Björn Ironside wanted immortality. He found fire. He wanted Rome. He found Luna. He wanted to return as the man who surpassed his father. Instead, he returned with fewer ships, fewer men, and a story that needed to be repaired before it could be sung. This is the part of history that never changes. Ambition is dangerous when it is guided by intelligence. But ambition without intelligence is a sail in a storm. It can move fast, it can look powerful, it can carry men far beyond the world they know. But eventually the wind changes. The water rises, the weight becomes too much, and the man who thought he was hunting discovers that he has been walking deeper and deeper into someone else's trap. The Vikings sailed south believing they were the nightmare, but Córdoba had already woken up, and when the fire came, the nightmare belonged to them. If this story pulled you in, subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which dark chapter of history you want next, because the past is full of men who believed they were unstoppable, right until the world found the perfect way to stop them.